Welcome to EPJ Pathshala. I am Pirzada Rauf. I teach at Jindal Global University, and today in the resource course we'll be dealing with geopolitical issues related to trade. The content of this topic is geopolitical role of trade, geopolitics in trade routes, and geopolitical disputes in trade. The learning outcome of this course would be it will discuss the geopolitics involved in the trade across nations. It will discuss geopolitics in disputes in trade and also understand the connection between state power and trade routes. The key words of this topic are hegemonic state, absolute individualism, market access, geopolitics, and trade routes. The geopolitical role of trade is very important. As we know, the cross-border trades have been hotspot for hegemonic state apparatus. The state always tries to have a control over export and imports of the other states. These controls are a way forward to establish an imperial power. Trade activities since the very ancient time had been a source of measuring the economic well-being of society. But in the modern world, especially after the growth of capitalism, trade has been used as a pretext to have a sovereign control over the other state. This practice goes in tandem with the concept of expanding living entity by Ratzel in the era of neoliberalism, where every form of trade has become a source of power assertion. The third world nations were compelled to make their borders porous to the financial capital. After the WTO agreements, the trade balance has shifted from underdevelopment to the developed economies. The inflow of capital is from the least developed countries to the highly developed ones, as noted by Piketty in 2013 August. The idea to have hegemony over global trade led to a new phase of capitalism, which Lenin terms as imperialism. When states are situated in the context of world of evolving social practices, they lose their exclusivity, but one historic role of states is thereby re-emphasized. This is that of the definition and regulation of property rights. The modern territorial state system has been associated from its origins in the Europe, especially Western Europe, in the 17th and 18th century. A world of territorial states with the framework for definitions of the property rights, legal rights or ownership of use, without which the global capitalism would not have been possible. States are never so sovereign in the conventional sense of singular entities endowed with the power monopolies within their territories as when they seem to have definers and enforcers of property rights. One of the features of state-centered accounts of speciality of power is that they are silent to the role of states which have played in the growth of certain basic social practices of capitalism, defining and protecting private property rights that have inexorably led beyond state boundaries in pursuit of wealth and the development of mobile or property capital. The term property implies as fixity or phenomenon in the place that the modern territorial state have given a high priority to protecting. Consequently, much of the law in most Western states is devoted to establishing rights of ownership and access. But a home territory also provides a base from which to launch attempts at acquiring private property elsewhere. This requires that assets be reasonably liquid and transferable over space and across state boundaries. At a certain point, however, states endure a tension, what Ruggie calls the problem of absolute individualism, which can give rise to an unbounding of territoriality when states effectively exchange, control economic flows emanating from their territories for increased access to the flows coming from elsewhere. As a result, when increasing proportions of property are made mobile beyond any one state's boundaries, individual states provide only a partial and tenuous protection for absolute property rights. Other geographical levels of governance and regulation become attractive, as was case with the Bretton Woods system that regulated international finance from 1940 to 1972, and is currently the case, if signally less effective, with the annual G8 summits between leaders of Big Seven industrial countries. But we have an uncertainty here as to the future of political actions and macroeconomic changes. In macroeconomic changes, we have tariffs, interest rates, etc., which also give us an incentive to property. The property holders to further spread their assets around rather than leave them pooled up in one state. This process is not new. Its origins go back to the merchant capitalism or mercantile capitalism of 16th century. What is new is the increased quantitative scale and the enlarged geographical and geopolitical scope of the mobile property now moving to and fro across the boundaries of the world trading system and investing states. In this context, states and firms have changed their orientation from free trade to what has been called market access. The underpinnings of the trade, rather the world trade regime that prevailed in the aftermath of World War II, are being replaced by those of a regime in which a premium is placed on openness of borders. The leakiness in cross-border flows of goods and investment and in the firm multinationalism has become a torrent of capital, the torrent of trade and corporate allies. Cauchy contrasts the nature of old regime with that of a new one by identifying the 6 pillars that they claim have underpinned each and the policy instruments associated with the new regime. Also, we have the pillars of emerging market access in the world economy and model developed by Cauchy, which talks about the policy instruments which reflect an abandonment of classical state sovereignty in return of guaranteed rights of access to other states' territories. The world has moved away from the strict association of property rights and capital accumulation with state territory and also with the range of non-territorial factors now determine the competitiveness of firms in many industries. Also, the access to technological marketing strategies, responsiveness to consumers, flexible management techniques, and all of these are now with the assets of firms and not territories. Firms grow though deploying their internal assets as successfully as possible. We also have states which now compete with one another and attract these mobile assets. These mobile assets are in the form of property to their territories. 3 aspects of market accesses and regimes which are particularly notable with respect to the changing speciality of power. One is internationalization of a range of domestic policies to conform to global norms of performance. Thus, not only trade policy but also industrial, product liability and social welfare policies are subject to definition and oversight in the terms of their impacts on market access between countries. Another is the increased trade in the services once produced and consumed largely within state boundaries. Partly, this reflects the fact that many manufactured goods now certain a large share of services inputs from R&D to marketing and advertisement. But it is also because the revolution in telecommunications means that many services from banking to design to packaging can now be provided with global markets. This represents a significant material challenge to the domestic versus international distinction upon which the realism of strictly territorial accounts of the speciality of power relies on. Finally, the spreading of reach of transnational firms and the emergence of international corporate alliances, which have had profound influences on the nature of trade and the investment flows, undermining the identity between territory and economy. Symptomatic of the integration of the trade and investment, which are frequently heard concerns as rules on international investment and unitary taxation, rules governing local content and the place of origin to the axis where value was added in the commodity chain of globalized production, and also the rules involving unfair competition and antitrust of monopoly trading practices. Again, we have geopolitics in trade routes. As the imperial countries direct their control over the third world nations, the trade routes linking the third world with their resource capital becomes a major spot for the naked play of the contradictions among the imperialistic power. In the world today, the major imperialist state like USA, China, Russia, UK, Japan, France, they compete to establish their geopolitical power over world's trade routes. In the fall of 2013, just months after assuming office, Chinese President Xi Jinping unveiled the One Belt, One Road initiative during visits to Kazakhstan and Indonesia. Before Xi, Chinese strategy had been inspired by Deng Xiaoping's warning in the 1990s that Chinese leaders, he insisted, should hide our capacities and bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile and never claim leadership. It is tempting to think that OBOR, that is One Belt, One Route, has a consequence of Chinese maturation and ambitious program of economic development that will vault the country into 21st century. To some, it is a direct challenge to United States, something that requires a new strategy from Washington if it has to remain on the top of global order. The problem with this line of thinking, as we know, will be analyzing the US perspective on OBOR in general, as that there is very little in this economic initiative to be or against it. It is little more than a pipe dream, and what has materialized from the dream, at least so far, does not hurt the US position. One Belt, Eurasia, OBOR is really two plans combined to form a larger framework of new trade routes. The first strategy is to build a rail and a road which will connect interior of China with the Middle East and Southern Asia. One of the most important provinces for One Belt, One Road is Jinping's Rashtu province, in which China's Uyghur Muslims reside. And its experience is a useful example of limitations inherent within One Belt. Xinjiang has seen an impressive growth in recent years. Its regional gross domestic product increased from 62% between 2010 and 2014, according to National Bureau of Statistics. The problem is that even for Xinjiang, the gravity of the global economy still pulls its economic activity east to the sea, not west to the center of Eurasia. There are no open source numbers available that break down Chinese exports by modes of transport, but the vast majority of China's exports with destinations in 2016, which were all countries to which Chinese goods arrived by sea and not by land. Here, we can talk about the insufficient regional infrastructure, which has tempered expectations, and these tempered expectations of increasing overland exports. But the bigger problem with One Belt is geopolitical. Eurasia is in its state of crisis, and several of the countries' China borders will feel the crisis particularly acutely in coming years. Central Asia, a patchwork of states whose borders were drawn to make the countries more easily controlled from Moscow during Soviet era, is hardly a promising market, and that too for Chinese goods. Furthermore, it is one of the most politically unstable regions of the world. One Belt is not a long march into prosperity. It is a long march into disaster, according to some think tanks. For United States, there is a single overarching strategic imperative in Eurasia to prevent the rise of power that could potentially challenge US hegemony in the world. And as we know it, that no such power is likely to appear anytime soon. And when, if One Belt were able to achieve its extremely ambitious goals, such a power would easily be or still be constrained by geography and regional rivalry. If anything, the US would welcome the possibility of improved infrastructure and increased trade, providing new economic opportunities to some of the impoverished and increasingly disabled regions of Middle East. The example of Middle East has descended into chaos largely because of the limited economic opportunities available to young people. If the construction of a vast network of trade infrastructure brings economic prosperity to Eurasia, most unstable regions, even if it enhances China's international prestige, the US could easily live with it. And one road, maritime, more important to the United States, is one road component of the initiative. China's vision of a new maritime Silk Road, according to United Nations, the Conference on Trade and Development, roughly 80% of the global trade by volume and over 70% of global trade by value is conducted by sea. The one road portion of OBOR is meant to increase Chinese construction of the ports in countries along with maritime routes that have already used in seaborne trade. China has already seen this strategy pay some dividends, having been awarded contracts to build ports in Myanmar and Sri Lanka. China also, however, had some setbacks. A big Beijing had to deal with Beijing that had Bangladesh fell through 2016 when Dhaka decided that an offer from Japan to build port will better suit it than Chinese construction companies. So, we will look at Washington's strategies and its imperative in seas, which is very simple in Eurasia, to prevent the rise of potential challenger. An imperative that entails dominating the seas and ensuring the flow of international trade. This is why one road is a little more concerning than one belt. The US can accept and even benefit from Chinese influence in Eurasia, but it cannot tolerate a Chinese navy commensurate with the ambition of one road. It signals Beijing's intent to expand the size and the capability of its navy. Still, from a US perspective, the importance of China's projects along with maritime Silk Road is significantly overinflated. Constructing ports will not provide China with permanent bases for Chinese destroyers or armies. The countries in question will yet have to agree to host them. More importantly, the Chinese Navy, despite its impressive advances over the last 25 years, is not capable of an extension and extending long-term deployments in countries far away from the mainland. As we have Dr. Bernard Cole, a professor at the National War College, he notes that in his latest book on Chinese Navy, the Navy lacks seaborne air power and has no fixed wing capability or capable ships. Only nascent in flight, refueling capacity, not airborne air control, and limited joint operational capacity with Air Force. Though equipped with an aircraft carrier to parade its advances, the Chinese Navy does not currently have a single carrier battle group trained and ready for action. The priority of Chinese Navy is to protect Chinese territorial claims on its littoral waters. The drama that surrounded US President-elect Trump phone conversation with the president of Taiwan in 2016 emphasized just how weak China is relative to United States. China can't really stop the United States from meddling in Taiwan, let alone match its navy pound for pound, so long as there is China's interests are actually in sync with those of US. At least when it comes to global maritime trade, this is because the Chinese economy depends on exports and the vast majority of that exports are shipped through sea. There are other reasons. One road will be ineffective. The US favors the status quo in Asia and so long the desire to challenge the balance of power. Smaller countries are suspicious of Chinese intentions. Though they would happily accept the Chinese money, there is no guarantee they will always do Beijing's bidding. US, its allies such as Japan, India, South Korea, Taiwan, moreover, have formidable navies that can curb Chinese assertion. All of this that lies a bigger flaw in Chinese strategy, even if Beijing were able to scrounge up the trillions of dollars needed to build infrastructure in the world's most inhospitable places. The fact remains it is appreciably cheaper to transport by sea than to transport by land. It is partly the reason why so-called trade is conducted by sea, and there is no reason to think that it will change anytime soon. OBOR, which has a maritime trade, already forms the basis of global economy and without any help from China. The geopolitical disputes in trade, the contradictions among the imperial nations are expressed in their tussles to establish the hegemony over third world nations. This contradiction is sometimes resolved by the bourgeoisie organization like UN and G20. But sometimes it becomes too sharp that it calls for war, hot or cold. Recently, at the insistence of United States, G20 members agreed to drop the forum's commitment to free trade. That agreement was reached at only meeting and was contained in a single document. Such agreements and documents are far from written in stone. Nevertheless, it must be regarded as a historical moment. While many G20 nations have practiced protectionism by formal or informal means when it suited them, allowing the commitment to free trade to be excluded from the agreement, which represents a fundamental shift in the concept which has been central to global economics for more than a generation and sacred since Ricardo made the case for it. We have the politics of decision, which is simple. The United States insisted that the commitment be left out of the document. President Donald Trump campaigned on the platform arguing that free trade is not a principle, but rather a tool for improving economic conditions of nations. If free trade failed to do so, it should be discarded. Trump argued that many nations such as China had not practiced free trade, although they had benefited from it. The US indicated that it would not sign G20 agreement if it contained wording on free trade. While there is much discussion on US decline, the country still produces 25% of the world's GDP, which is a huge amount, and therefore any document on global economics that does not contain an American signature will become irrelevant. Not only that G20 is averse to irrelevant pronouncements, but in this case, the US wanted to show down on free trade and other members backed away. The G20 recognized that the handwriting on the free trade is on the wall, not only once put by United States there. In the end, each nation pursues its own interests, but for most part, free trade has appeared advantageous to all of them. But the problem is that we are in an export crisis, as we have previously discussed the geopolitical futures. The year 2008 threw Europe and United States into recession. This cut China's exports at the time when the other countries were becoming increasingly competitive. While industrial commodity market expected China to resume its exports and purchase raw materials, prices remained high. When China comes to export at the priority level, it can lead to collapsing of industrial economy. Free trade theory in this abstract is very powerful. It dictates that if all the nations concentrate on selling what they are most efficient at producing, leaving the rest to others, everyone will benefit. Accordingly, if United States is not an efficient at producing steel as it is at producing computer codes, it can stop producing steel and produce more computer codes or software. The theory of comparative advantage that Ricardo laid out makes a great deal of sense abstractly, and the international system which has since been in awe of this principle. Depending on the circumstances, the rest of the country, a vast overgeneralization, saw free trade as a threat to their current incomes and future hopes. They voted for Trump, and the US then told G20 that free trade is off the table, and G20 agreed because regardless of who is president, the US's 800-pound gorilla, Xi, could have given up the idea of free trade as it could bring pain to economy. Machiavelli is grinding ear to ear, as Friedman into said. In the summary, we will see that in the era of neoliberalism, where every form of trade has become a source of power assertion, the third world nations are compelled to make their borders porous to financial capital. In the world today, the major imperialist states like USA, China, Russia, Japan, France, they compete to establish their geopolitical power over world's trade routes. The contradictions among the imperial nations are expressed in their tussles to establish the hegemony over third world nations. This contradiction is sometimes resolved by the bourgeoisie organization like UN and G20. But sometimes it becomes too sharp that it calls for a war, hot or cold. With this, we are done with this course. Thank you. Thank you very much.